Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Themis Group webinar on policing strategies to successfully manage protests. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here this afternoon, this evening, for those of you who are in Europe, and the afternoon for those of you who are in North America. Our plan with this webinar this afternoon is to, in fact, just have three of our experts speak for about 45 minutes or so. We'll also have 15 substantive slides covering various aspects of the webinar, which incorporate the comparative cases between Northern Ireland and the United States, Bloody Sunday and Baltimore, developing an effective strategy and plan, command and engagement protocols, developing intelligence and assessing intelligence threats accurately, tactical policing options and challenges, making decisions that withstand scrutiny, which is an absolutely crucial part of managing a successful protest environment, communication with communities and partners, and investigation and evidence gathering, and then finally looking back and learning. And after that, we will take the opportunity to take some questions from you, our audience. Before I start that process, however, I would like to introduce our panel this afternoon. First of all, we have Stephen Cargan, a former Assistant Chief Constable in Northern Ireland and a highly experienced strategic and tactical operational commander, public order commander, as well as being a firearms and critical incident commander and assessor. We also have Alison Ferguson, who has more than 30 years of operational policing experience in Northern Ireland and is an expert in community policing, community engagement, and an experienced public order commander. And then last but not least, we have Stephen Atkinson, who has also 30 years of service in policing in Northern Ireland. He's an expert in counterterrorism, security, and at a national security level. And he was also a senior inspector and specialist tactical commander with extensive experience in managing threat environments, accountability, and commanding multi-agency operations. So I think we can safely say we have an experienced team to take you through the various aspects of this webinar this afternoon. And as I mentioned, one of the things that we're going to be doing today is just looking at two comparative cases. The Northern Ireland Bloody Sunday event, which took place in 1972, and the protests that took place in Baltimore in 2016. And as you can see on the screen, there is a very close correlation between these two events and how they played out, particularly from the point of view that the case details are quite similar in some ways, that there's a death resulting from law enforcement, which leads to protests, that the key issues in the one situation in Northern Ireland revolve around religion, justice, and police tactics, which are heavy-handed, and then also community distrust of the authorities. And of course, in Baltimore, as a comparator, there is the issue of police tactics and community distrust. And then there's also the context, which is the troubles in Northern Ireland, which have taken place over many, many years, and also in the United States, the repeated cases of alleged police malpractice. The policing arrangements are also very similar. In Northern Ireland, the police are fully armed, which is not the usual case in the United Kingdom. For those of you who are not familiar, most police in the UK are not armed. But in Northern Ireland, all police officers are in fact armed, and that is the same situation as in the United States. And then there is, it's a very highly scrutinized policing environment in Northern Ireland. And I think we've come to see in recent months and years that it's in the US, it's also a very highly scrutinized policing environment. And then the approach, the police reaction in Northern Ireland has become over time a more strategic approach. They have learned from lessons over many years, and many hard lessons, I believe, to come up with a strategic and effective plan that reduces the risk of escalation and violence. And from what we've seen in Baltimore, for example, the approach was very largely reactive to the situation, which I think in some ways contributed to the way that situation played out. Just to give you a little bit of background as to why Northern Ireland is relevant, as I mentioned before, it was established in the early part of the last century. It's a society which is very much divided along religious, political, and social lines. And in fact, it's one where protest events take place on an incredibly regular basis. So there are more than 3,000 annual public protest events taking place in a very small province of the United Kingdom on an annual basis, and at least 150 or so of those involve serious or violent incidents of public order, disorder, and rioting. So I think our speakers today, who have all worked in this environment for a very long time, I think have some experience that they could certainly share with us. And the policing arrangements, as I mentioned before, are that they are fully armed. The responsibility for local policing is delegated to local commanders. So there is a context there which US colleagues will be very familiar with, a very localized policing arrangement. Policing reform in Northern Ireland has learned from previous experience to transition to better approaches. And I think that's something which our speakers will focus on quite heavily today. And also, as we mentioned, it is very highly scrutinized with high levels of public media and legal focus, something our experts will also be sharing with all of you. Just to compare with what happened in Baltimore, we all know that it happened in 2016. Freddie Gray died in police custody, which is what sparked the protest. And what were initially peaceful demonstrations escalated into violent riots. So with the key issues around race, justice, and police brutality, and general distrust of the community, I think there's a very strong parallel with some of the situations that have been faced by our experts in their own environment in Northern Ireland. Of course, the question that arises is, could the police have handled these protests differently and to avoid escalation and violence, and if so, how? And I think that's the question that we will try to address today and give some insights as to how our friends in the police service of Northern Ireland over the years have learned to manage these things in a way that tries to avoid escalation. For those of you who are not familiar, Bloody Sunday is an event that took place in 1972. British troops opened fire on a civil rights march, killing 13 people, and 40 years later, a British soldier is on trial accused of two murders and 4 attempted murders in that particular event. And there is still tremendous public interest in this case. It's a continuing situation in Northern Ireland, and there are some very key issues here which play into the process, into community tensions, a very high potential for violence. Police officers are often injured during these clashes, and police are often required to call in additional resources to deal with these issues. And in fact, in some cases, there is even the possibility that terrorists may use the protests as an opportunity to attack police with high-powered weapons and to engage in incredible violence. So the Northern Ireland police have learned some very hard lessons since 1972, and have evolved their approach to policing protests to try and ensure the minimum of violence. And it's that experience which we hope we will share with you today. One of the key factors, of course, is the importance of developing an effective strategy and plan. And our first speaker this afternoon is going to be Stephen Cargan, who's very familiar with policing in the context of communities in conflicts where there's low levels of public confidence and trust in the police, and also high levels of threat in the context of public disorder. And Stephen, setting your experience against this background, in what ways can our colleagues learn from your experience in developing these strategies, which are so crucial to managing these operations successfully? And how can they improve public confidence and yet still reduce the threat of violence? It's difficult to know how a situation will materialize and what ways others will react when tensions are high. So what benefits can others learn from your experience in putting together this kind of effective plan and strategy? Stephen, please, you have the floor. Stephen, you're muted.
Apologies. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you for the opportunity just to share some experiences with you. The first thing I want to cover off in this part of the presentation is gold strategies, the strategic plan for policing protests. This effectively can be viewed as a legal document because it's likely to be scrutinised with others. There's a very public case in Northern Ireland to do with the Bobby Story funeral, which was one of the most senior Irish Republican Army intelligence leads, who was buried in June last year. That policing operation has been highly scrutinised in the media and by others. So my points that I want to share with you is this. There are 4 key elements that I want to talk to you tonight about to developing a sound and defensible strategy. I use this word defensible and legally, a legal document, for various reasons. Before I retired, I was in Legacy and Justice Department for the Police Service of Northern Ireland. And on any day, we had 250 pieces of live litigation, mainly looking at the past and how the police had policed operations in the past. There's a tremendous amount of learning in that, which all of us will share with you tonight. The first element is this, the overarching aim of your strategy. It allows you as a commander or leader to put your ethical stamp, your expectations of others, what do you expect from them, to set the tone, the direction for others to follow. If you get the tone wrong, you risk exacerbating or escalating violence. An example of a strategy that I've previously used is this. To protect the legitimacy of the police and whatever organisations you might be working with, to maintain confidence in our ability to keep communities safe, police protests and maintain order, and we will strive to minimise the risk to others, applying a graduated response to any protest or violence, and we will work in partnership with others to maximise the safety of everyone involved in the protest and others likely to be effective. And then the policing style will be collaborative, high visibility policing, friendly and engaging, and sensitive to any increased tensions and threats. That's just a very broad overview of a potential overarching aim that you might want to use. The more simple it is, easier understandable, the better. In terms of the next element is your strategic objectives. There's many of those that we could mention, but some of the key ones that I want to just encourage you and share with you is this. Uphold our legislative requirements under the Human Rights Act, use of force, legal responsibilities to protect others, and every police service will have those responsibilities. Another aim will be around intelligence, developing the intelligence picture and disseminating intelligence effectively, and we'll cover off more about intelligence later. Develop an effective and maintain a community impact assessment, which is something that's really important as a commander, that you will want to have that assessment completed, somebody looking at that, and you're constantly knowing what the potential community impact is. Developing contingencies to support your goal strategy is an important part. Another part is effective communications plan to respond to media lines of inquiry, making sure you're communicating briefings, which are very, very important. And again, we'll talk more about communications. Developing your criminal justice strategy, which is very important to support the investigation and evidence gathering. Developing your consequence management plan. You can expect consequences. So in that, we need to have an effective plan to manage that. Developing your resource plan, making sure you have the resources required to support your goal strategy and what your intentions are. Completing a risk assessment, appointing risk owners, and actually making sure that the risk assessment is constantly reviewed so that you know exactly what are the main risks here, how those risks changing, and we'll talk a wee bit more about that later. And then developing a collaborative approach, which has been something as policing evolved in Northern Ireland. We are, when I talk about we, the Northern Ireland Police Service is one of the most highly regulated and reformed police service of any police service in the Western world. Most academics will tell you that. But that collaborative approach, working in partnership with others, protest organisers, communities, business representatives, justice agencies, police agencies, and other departments. The third element that I want to share with you is this around roles and responsibilities. It's important that you have the right people to support you as you develop your strategy, getting your information, developing your plan, having the right expertise around you in the room. The Brobby story investigation, which is a really good one that I mentioned, which is ongoing at the minute. There's criticism that the goal commander didn't have intelligence agencies, didn't have legal representative early enough on in his planning process. But having the right people, I'm using the language here, trained, accredited, and competent staff, those are key things to think about. Are your staff trained? Are they actually accredited and competent? We have national accreditations that each of us would have had in the policing, and that's important. But also allocating responsibility to those key people to help you exercise and not only develop your plan, but to deliver your plan. And then the last area that I want to share with you is this around outcomes. Three elements that in a good goal strategy which you should consider. Having your preferred outcomes. Here's my preferred outcomes. For example, a peaceful protest, confidence in policing is maintained. An acceptable outcome might be minor disorder, minor offences, and minor disruption to normal life. And then an unacceptable outcome, perhaps you might want to be no loss of life, no major disturbances, no major roads or arterial routes blocked, and so forth. So that's a kind of very quick overview in the goal strategy, and hopefully we'll talk maybe more about that, Mark.
Thank you so much, Stevie. And I think you've touched on the high level element of a strategy that needs to be implemented to manage these things effectively. But one of the things that you talked about there was command and engagement protocols, which is our next issue. And Steve Atkinson is somebody who has a lot of experience in dealing with these protocols and how they work, and what do you see, Steve, as the critical elements that must be considered when you plan an operation? Can I ask you, at what stage of the planning process should you try and consider if there is potential for involvement, for example, of armed officers? And what would the role of those officers be? How would they be deployed? And then lastly, at what stage might a public order or tactical commander hand responsibility for an event or an operation over to a specialist firearms commander if that becomes necessary? What are the sort of circumstances that would dictate that being necessary? Steve, you have the floor, please.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to everyone tonight, and welcome everyone. It's a great privilege to get the chance to engage with so many people around this. And just to follow on from what Stevie was saying around building his strategy, this is a really important part that we look at the command and engagement protocols. And I suppose one of the things we've learned in Northern Ireland, and we're now starting to see it played out across the United States and the rest of the world, is the pace of threat escalation and the transition that we see in demonstrations. So what starts out as a demonstration protest very quickly moves to disorder, and then we have riotous violent behaviour, and even certainly in Northern Ireland, and it's out there for the rest of the other countries involved as well, that we see it move on to a ballistic threat. So that transition of threat and risk is moving at pace as we see these demonstrations progress across the globe. And we need to be ready for that. There's no point in us coming to a demonstration, to police a demonstration, if we're not. We need to be ready at an early stage. Effectively, the more complicated and the more as these demonstrations grow themselves and learn and evolve how to be more agile, how to move people around the streets, and how to create a bigger problem for us. Well, we're effectively taking on a network now. It's not just a small group of people, and in order to deal with a network, you need a network yourself. So, as far as command and engagement protocols are concerned, at the really early planning stage, to be ready for that, we need to have those protocols built into that strategic plan, so the commander can deliver effectively across the threat landscape, because it is a wide and varied threat landscape, as we know. So it's really important that all the different specialisms, whether internal or external, whether it's internal specialist firearms or externally emergency services, medics, fire response, we need to have that cooperation and collaboration with all those agencies. But more importantly, we need to have set down by the commander clear protocols as to when we might tip the balance and move into an area where perhaps a commander might need to call on another specialism, which would require an additional command structure to kick in. And that, a lot of the time, that means bringing the decision makers to the decision, as opposed to bringing it the other way around. So when we have all those people in the room with the correct command protocols set up and engaged, very often we can mitigate a lot of the risk around these demonstrations just by the tactical advice that exists in that command room when all those protocols are in place. Can very often show a commander something that he might be able to, or she might be able to do in their strategic plan that can offset and mitigate a risk somewhere else. So identifying those at the early stage and at the planning stage, as far out as possible, is really, really important, because when it comes to the day, you're ready for hopefully you're ready for the whole gambit that exists in the risk landscape. That co-location thing is very important as well, when those protocols are set up. And I'm just thinking of one in Belfast we had a number of years ago, where we had very quickly a move to a ballistic threat. So we've got public order police resources out there dealing with an ongoing violent riot situation, and all of a sudden we have the inject of loyalist paramilitary use the cover of riot to try and injure police officers. Very quickly, because of all the tactical advice and the command protocols are in the room, that advice was given quickly to withdraw those police officers that are on the front line dealing with that disorder back to ballistic cover, to allow specialist resources to go elsewhere, quite close to where they're working, and recover the firearm and mitigate that threat. And within a very short space of time, we're able to create an environment where the public order resources could then go back into the community and help protect property, protect people, and help police the demonstration safely. So that was a very real example, a very lifetime example of where we had a transfer of command, where the threat became a ballistic and life-threatening Article 2 threat for us. But because all the command protocols were in place and all the tactical advice was in the one room at the one time, commanders were able to bounce off each other effectively and protect one, whilst another commander was able to deliver specialist resources into the community close by and recover the weapon to allow the public order command to kick back in again and police the demonstrations. That was a real sort of lifetime example of how that can work and how it's evolved over the years here in Northern Ireland. Finally, one of the other points that's touched on, and certainly the commander would be very, very conscious of, would be those agreed engagement protocols as well. Last thing a commander wants is the messaging that they're putting out to the community around their policing, as Stevie said, their policing posture to police the demonstration. The last thing we want is mixed messaging into the community. So again, very clear and definitive protocols from the command through to those engaging with the communities themselves. We can't. It has proven problematic for us in Northern Ireland, where we have a commander who is set up for a posture on one footing, and then someone else in the chain somewhere is injecting a different message, and that can cause real problems for us. Again, I'm quite happy later on, Mark, to engage around some of that stuff and take questions on that.
Thank you, Stevie. I think there's a lot to think about in terms of the way that the command protocols work. But I think also one of the things that is absolutely crucial is the issue of intelligence and developing and assessing the threats accurately. The sight of extremists or violent actors infiltrating protests and demonstrations is something which is becoming an increasingly global phenomenon. And I think the challenge that law enforcement professionals and commanders and leaders have is how do you assess that threat? How do you recognize and mitigate the escalation of tension in opposing communities to maintain public safety? And also, most importantly, confidence in your organization during the policing protest. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, Steve.
Yeah, Mark, I'll quickly have a look at that. And certainly, I know probably the most critical piece of this would be an understanding of the scope for intel collection. I think very often we get, to use a football analogy, we play with the ball at our feet and we tend to look down at what's going on in and around the demonstration. We've learned in Northern Ireland that it's a very much a heads-up approach. When we're planning through policing demonstration, it needs to be a heads-up approach that's looking out across the whole intelligence community, not just what's happening on the day. And in terms of long-term planning for that, intelligence plays a massive part for the commander's strategy development as well. And when we think about long game opportunities, from human virtual, social media collection and data mining around that, agents of influence that can go back into the community and perhaps work a two-way street with that intelligence flow, technical opportunities that might exist, they can all help to shape long-term opportunities around the commander's policing plan for this strategy. And it's something we as a policing community need to be thinking about a lot further out from the day of the demonstration in terms of pushback to intelligence resources. And then on the day itself, again, it's easy to get focused on the event and policing the event. But we've really learned in Northern Ireland that dynamic intelligence collection is massive, and it has saved lives undoubtedly during demonstrations, policing demonstrations across the province. And thinking again with that heads-up approach to intelligence, that what external CCTV can bring outside your immediate policing area, what aerial surveillance can bring, not just to policing the demonstration, but how we can analyse what's going on in the community on a wider basis, and where pockets of people are, where groups are, where threat groups might be. If we think of it in an intelligence mindset and not just an operational mindset, well, it can be both on the day for us. And similarly with human, we shouldn't rule out pushing back to the intelligence community. There are people out there in the community that are prepared, to assist with this. And again, lifetime human intelligence in situations like, especially where there's a ballistic threat on the horizon, again, can save lives. So it's how we manage that. We need to do that. We need to do that on an ongoing, continual basis and a long way out. Again, another thing I would point to is our tension monitoring, in the community. And this again starts way back. How are we monitoring that? How are we analysing it? Are we analysing it effectively? what's our community policing posture? Is it leaning into the community, and are we able to retrieve intelligence from that, or are we reactive to the community? Our key stakeholders and partner, what's our partners? What's our confidence levels like with those? Is that another area of intelligence that we can glean from? If we have the luxury of long game planning, which sometimes you just don't, and sometimes you do, we need to know what are the gaps in our intelligence as we work, as the commander works towards the plan. What are the gaps? What do we know? What could we know, and what should we know? And don't be afraid to push back on those gaps and task those questions back into the intelligence community within your own service and wider afield. And again, the probably a game changer for us all has been being alive to social media and what that brings to us in terms of intelligence gathering, but with the caveat that these groups learn and evolve the same way that police organizations do. So you need, as Steve said, we need good analysts in there, good people that are analysing that and interpreting that intelligence correctly, because we all know they'll misdirect us, they'll feed in misinformation into the social media just to misdirect police resources and try and make their life easier. So that's all stuff that's key and critical around assessing the threat and developing intelligence around a plan. And again, it's a massive scope for learning, certainly from Northern Ireland. I'm happy to talk through it with everyone later on if the questions are there. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Stevie. And of course, once you have a plan and you have some engagement rules and you have some intelligence, it's important to then understand what your tactical options are and also what the challenges are. And Alison Ferguson is somebody who's faced some of these questions in her time and her career. And you have experience as a command trainer and a public order and safety advisor. With that sort of background, what do you think, in relation to there being no bad tactics or a wrong time to use tactics? Can you perhaps outline, Alison, a situation where you've had an experience of being involved in one of these protest situations and had to use different tactics and different policing options that will give you the outcome that's required? Alison, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening, everybody. And I think, when we talk about tactical policing options and challenges, and Stephen Cargan already discussed it or touched on it when he talked about developing a strategic plan, is that it's so important to have your tactical commander who's trained and accredited and competent and qualified to police that type of event. And part of that will also be around, having an awareness and a knowledge of current police tactics to clearly understand the strategic intention. Stephen talked about the preferred, acceptable and unacceptable outcomes, but for your tactical and operational commanders, then they need to understand what the tipping points are among those. So what has to happen in that protest or that situation for us to move to a different type of tactical option, or to use probably more firmer tactics. It's also important that your commander understands the potential outcomes that could arise from the use of certain public order tactics. It might, some of them might aggravate the situation, some of them might increase tensions. I mean, in Northern Ireland, some communities strongly dislike the use of police Land Rovers. As I had quoted to me on one occasion, they felt that the use of those sorts of vehicles gave a poor impression of that area and communities didn't like them. So, it's about the commander having contingencies in place as well to manage the potential outcomes that may occur within an event in any given scenario. And I think as well, whilst the commander might be trained, accredited and competent, they may lack some experience. And I know in the past in Northern Ireland, we would have had some mentors to assist those commanders in the early stages of their command careers in policing those operations. And I think it's vitally important, and it's been discussed already tonight, is when we talk about a graduated response and how important that is. And probably years ago, we wouldn't have realised just how important that was. We were there we were the police, and we were there to police the event. But now, I think we need to think about the purpose of the protests of the event, and that's something that we learned in Northern Ireland. Understand what the community's concerns are and the context of those, and then taking any intelligence into account, decide what the appropriate response to the event or protest is. We understand this can be really challenging. We've been through it. It's already been touched on tonight. It's the need to balance the fact that sometimes communities just need to be heard against the fact that there are occasions that people who are intent on causing violence for their own aims may try to have an impact, may try to attack police or draw police into situations. And that's all set against the potential of a ballistic threat, which we're all unfortunately too aware of. When we talk about the tactical options, there's a very wide range available to us. And I think what we had learned, and Stephen talked about style and tone, and he talked about a graduated response and engagement. And I think if we start with the lowest intervention possible, sometimes using more forceful tactics might seem at the outset to be the preferred option, such as the armoured vehicles we've talked about, police officers in protective clothing with shields, etc. But sometimes the use of those tactics can increase tensions and raise tensions and create bigger problems for the police and the communities in the longer run. So sometimes it can be a bit around holding your nerve, but that's obviously taking taking all the intelligence into account. In a protest scenario, is there an organizer or person of influence who can help? Could it reduce tensions, prevent them from occurring in the first place, where we talk to those trusted people within the communities and hear what the community's concerns are and listen to what they're telling us before we react? Are there local police officers available who are known to those communities and who are likely to know those key people within those communities as well, so that we can get the conversations ongoing and things to try to reduce tensions as much as possible? And then if all of that fails, or any of that isn't appropriate, we then can increase to more forceful tactics once those agreed tipping points have been reached. And if we do all of that in a graduated way, that will help to reduce or avoid the perception that the police have behaved in a heavy-handed way and have actually made the violence worse. And like everybody else, Mark, I'm happy to take any questions later on.
Thank you very much, Alison. I think it was a really good elaboration of the way that tactical options can be employed. But once you begin to employ tactical options, you're making decisions. And I think the most crucial thing that perhaps some of our participants this afternoon will be interested in is the issue of making decisions that withstand scrutiny, because I think that's one of the areas that people are most concerned about these days. And Stephen Cargan, you've been in these situations where you're under extreme pressure from others, and you have to make decisions which may well have impacts for decades to come. You mentioned earlier some of the legacy issues that you've dealt with. And you've been a senior commander making life-threatening decisions and have been at the forefront supporting these legal challenges on behalf of the police service to some of the decisions that have been made. What lessons can you share with us around this issue of making good decisions that withstand scrutiny?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for Alison and Stephen, their contribution. Just before I kind of talk specifically about decision making, a point that I think it's important to remember as well, and just reiterate to people, is around scenario planning. One of the things that I've benefited, and I know others, colleagues will have as well, is the ability to do scenario planning, before the event goes live. Scenario planning, it allows you to strengthen your resilience and effectively defend your plan. It allows you to practice along with your team, along with the professionals and experts, and make sure before you go live actually that in doing that you can examine the likely risks. You look at your weaknesses, helps you look at your vulnerabilities, and then it also helps you to predict your potential outcomes. Scenario planning allows you to get the opportunity to mitigate then those risks that you've identified. And then lastly, another thing about it, it allows you to identify the intelligence gaps. As Stevie has already said, quite often there will be intelligence gaps. There may be resource gaps and information, skills, equipment. And the benefit about scenario planning, where Alison has articulated around the tactics, just gives you the opportunity before things go live to kind of really test and stress test your plan. So in terms of decision making, before I retired, I was responsible for overseeing one of the many public inquiries in an inquest, Keynes Mills. It was at one of the worst atrocities in Northern Ireland's terrible history. But I witnessed a 75-year-old detective sergeant and a former state pathologist in his 80s giving an account of their decisions that they'd made 40 years previously. You might think that how could that be? That is the reality of policing in Northern Ireland, and I dare say it will be the reality of policing in many other parts of the world. It certainly is. In the last few days, we've seen a similar situation where police officers were on trial for the Hillsborough disaster, another incident that happened many decades ago. So what I share with you here is kind of my experiences around decision making, having to defend decisions legally. First thing I want to share with you this is keep good records. Sometimes it's hard to keep records of your decisions in a fast moving situation where you're responding to spontaneous things that are going on, but we all have access to digital recorders. If you have access to get staff to support you making those recording those decisions. And remember, disclosure, your decisions at some point could quite possibly be disclosed. If you don't have a full intelligence picture, very often we never have 100% coverage of the intelligence. But if you don't have it, say so. Because if you're going to be examined later on at some point, maybe decades later, you'll never remember why you made those decisions. And you'll have barristers and legal teams quizzing you and so forth. Articulate the reasons for your decisions, including your rationale, and have that in your policy files. Because as I say, in time, you will never remember that. Seek as much information as you need. And don't be afraid to push back at people, the intelligence agencies, those people who are giving you that information. Don't be afraid to push back and say, is that all the information? Have you any other information? And retask them to get you that information. Use those assets that are available to you. Also, don't be afraid to check the authenticity of the information that you're being given. Make sure you understand exactly what people are saying to you, because never be afraid to challenge and make sure you understand. In the UK, we have a 5x5 grading system, but it's important when you're going to make difficult decisions, don't be afraid to challenge and make sure you're 100% satisfied that you understand what people are telling you. And don't be afraid to actually ask people to confirm, have you told me and given me all the information that you're aware about? Because actually, if you make decisions which potentially result in responses where the actions of others are very significant and potentially lead to the loss of life, which is the reality around some of the command decisions that some of us may end up making, make sure that you have challenged as much as you possibly can. The other thing is take advice from others. When you're making decisions, take advice from experts. Have them in the room with you as you test out your scenario planning, test out the information and so forth. Make sure you take advice from legal experts and so forth, because ultimately, as a commander, you will make a decision based on all that information and you hold that responsibility. And then the final thing that I would share with you is this. If you fail to listen and consider all the available facts, you risk making a poor decision at worst or the wrong decision. We have an old saying, and as investigators, ABC, assume nothing, believe nobody, and challenge everything. If you remember nothing else, remember that. Assume nothing, believe nobody, and challenge everything. Thank you, Mark. Happy to take further questions later on relating to this.
Thank you, Stevie. And I think that neatly brings us to the issue of communication with communities, because it's that issue, that engagement with communities, that is always going to be the crucial part of managing any of these protest challenges successfully. And Alison, you've faced dealing with communities in the context of low levels of public confidence in some areas, a lack of trust, a lack of communication with local authorities and with the police. From your experience, can you give us an insight into how communication helps to build that confidence with the police and minimize the risk of tensions escalating in these situations?
Thank you, Mark. And as you can all see from the slide there, in Northern Ireland, we had the implementation of our communication strategy, which was keeping people safe by policing with the community. So we latterly had assumed a position of collaborative working. So we've already talked about working with internal and external partners. And I think before we talk about communicating externally, and Stephen Cargan did touch on it in his early slides around officer briefings, I think before we go out to police a protest or police an event, or even in day-to-day policing, it's vital to ensure that every officer is fully briefed and is aware of their role and what's expected of them. Stephen talked about setting the style and tone, about a friendly tone and policing high visibility clothing, engaging with the community. And it's important that officers know that that's what's expected of them. And I think as well, if we want to ensure that officers are confident in their ability to perform their role and therefore inspire confidence in local communities, they need to be properly briefed about the history of the event or the protest, if it's applicable, any information or intelligence there may be in respect of the event or protest, and any legislation that they may need. Stephen touched on scenario planning, so some potential offences may have been identified there. So it's important that officers are equipped with the proper legislation that they may need to use during the course of that event. And I think as well, we talked about communication and collaboration and about key contacts in local communities, persons of influence within local communities, and it's about continuing to communicate with those people. And when we talk about trusted people within their own communities, it could be community workers, youth workers, political or church representatives, and your police in your own areas will know who those people are. I would say it's so important not to make promises that you can't keep. We'd all love to give the community exactly what they want, and unfortunately it's not always possible. And if we make promises we don't keep, then obviously that leads to a reduction again in public confidence. Manage expectations as well. I touched earlier on how some areas really dislike the use of certain types of police vehicles, and whilst we try to work with communities as much as possible, it's important that they know that at times we will have to resort to those types of tactics. But and again, in doing that as well, we're ensuring a no surprises approach. So we're not, so when we're consulting with those key people within communities, we're letting them know how we plan to police the event. So we've talked about a no surprises approach, but they'll also be aware that we are prepared for any eventuality that might occur. If you have a protest situation, and we saw this in Northern Ireland with the Soldier F protests and counter protests, if there are opposing sides within that protest situation that you're aware of in advance, if possible, meet and consult with both sides, because that shows that you're, as a police service, being impartial and transparent. And I think when you're being transparent, then that reduces the opportunity for other people to fill in the gaps and create any misinformation that there may be around policing in the areas. And we've talked again about social media. So ongoing public messaging by the police on social media we found was really beneficial. because we had some control over the flow of information, and we've all seen and learned how with the involvement of mobile phone cameras and all of that, how very quickly the public can get information into the public domain. So it's important that we as police officers try as much as possible to put out our own information. And lastly, I would say keep the lines of communication open with the communities, both before, during and after the events. Keep communities informed, which will help reduce the mistrust, and where possible, when we talked about it, when we discussed graduated response, try and find out what the community's expectations are of that event or of that protest, so that we as police then know what their expectations are. So thank you.
Thanks, Alison. And I think the next thing that we really wanted to look at then was the issue of investigation and evidence gathering. And I pose the question now really to all three of our speakers, and I'll perhaps ask Stephen Cargan to kick off. But the issue is that during these protest situations, the conducting of an impartial and high quality investigation is really one of the primary functions of the police. And how do you see the most effective way in helping achieve this, particularly when you're dealing with such a dynamic situation as a protest event that's taking place? Stephen Cargan, do you want to kick off?
Yes, thanks, Mark. From a strategic point of view, one of the most important aspects of your gold strategy or plan is having the input of a senior investigating officer, or as an SIO, as we call them. And that strategy for me, and from personal experience, is so important. And the key aspects that I would want to see in that strategy are setting the tone for the investigation. How are they going to provide the resources, the investigative resources? How are they going to gather that information or intelligence evidence that you need? Is it going to be done legally? Will it be done effectively? I make that point as well. There's some really interesting reviews of how police have policed the pandemic recently. And some of the criticism of policing has been that they failed to gather their own information, their own evidence, and they're relying on social media and on the media footage to actually take cases for prosecution. That's an important point, as a police agencies, where we can use the equipment that we have and the expertise that we have to try, where possible, to gather the evidence that we need. It's not always possible, it's difficult, but actually that's important. The other key things for me in terms of that SIO strategy, the arrest strategy, what are the likely offences going to be? What are the powers of arrest? Again, go back to Alison's communication, making sure that we know how are we going to arrest people? When are we going to arrest people as part of that investigation? Are we going to arrest them during the event? Do we consider that as a tactic? Well, actually, we might say, well, actually, we did that, it'll make things worse. So we actually we'll make those arrests afterwards. And then making sure as well, liaising with the prosecution agencies, the Crown Prosecution Service, public prosecution agencies and so forth, prior to events is also so important to actually understand, well, here's what we're doing. What is your burden of proof? What do you expect in terms of the investigation and the legislation requirements? So that's kind of some of my points, and I'll hand over now to Alison and Stephen.
Thanks, Stevie. And I think just a couple of points moving on from when you talked about your arrest strategy and talked about increased tensions. I think the other thing to consider when we're looking at tensions and police actions is how will we gather our evidence? So are we going to do it in vehicles? Are we going to do it with officers on foot, with handheld cameras? What type of uniform are the officers going to wear? Again, if we're trying to keep it quite a low-key event, will the officers just be in normal high visibility uniform and on foot? Or have we intelligence to say there's likely to be disorder, in which case then vehicles would be more appropriate for your evidence gathering? And again, that's just something to think about at the planning stage. And another thing that the senior investigating officer may wish to do is to actually visit the site where the protest or event's likely to take place and look at the best locations in which to base or forward base your evidence gathering capability, just to make sure that we're best placed to gather best evidence at that time. Stevie Atkinson, I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
No, I think you've covered everything. Just one thing I would say, one of our colleagues would say that the investigation starts at the planning stage. Yeah. I think, as you said very rightly, Stevie, the SIO needs to be identified at that stage, so his investigative team can go out onto the ground and walk the ground themselves, look at the best opportunities that exist for them to recover the evidence, because it's very hard to do it on the day, and giving them the best possible chance as early as possible in the planning is the way ahead on that. So just to confirm what's already been said, I suppose. Thanks, Mark.
Another point just before we hand over to yourself, Mark. If you look at the slides there, the photograph at the bottom, the Land Rover on fire, that's an evidence gathering truck or Land Rovers, we would call them. If you look at the camera on the roof, people will target your evidence gathering teams. They know they don't want to be caught. So that vehicle's on fire. The evidence gathering team are inside that vehicle, and that's your camera. So it's just remember that as a tactical point to make sure that of the safety of those people and the effectiveness of gathering your evidence using a Land Rover in a scenario where there's going to be a riot, where you know that potentially they'll try and set that vehicle on fire. It's not very pleasant being inside them either for those of us who have experienced it. But that's just a point to make there. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Stevie. Thank you, Alison and Stephen as well. And I mean, I think, you know, you make a very good point about taking away some lessons from this. And I think the last point we wanted to address today, before we go to questions and answers from our participants, is the issue of looking back and learning. And it's important to learn from the experiences that you've had over the years. And it's important to learn from the mistakes, but also from the successes that you've had. And I wonder whether, you know, Steve Cargan, whether you want to just give us a little bit of an insight into that issue of looking back and learning. What are the most important lessons that need to be learned from the way that these protests are managed? And how do you take those lessons forward into the next engagement that you face?
Two aspects that I'll share is the first one is about reviews. You know, you can do a review during your planning, during a live event or afterwards, but reviews give you the opportunity to assess your plan. It helps you to check what what others are doing. It gives you the opportunity to check and listen to what others are saying. It gives you the opportunity to review your intelligence. It allows you to flex up and down your plan, your strategy, your resources. It allows you to check the progress, make those changes. Reviews, in fact, are really good practice. It's good leadership, and I like to say it makes for better decision making. And the second point is around independent reviews. I do these professionally now. I've done them professionally for many years, and I've invited many people to come and do professional reviews. And you'll see that quite often with a lot of chief constables, chief officers, where they'll invite other police services in to do an independent review. It's very useful, really good. And actually, the higher the risks, the more vulnerability there is around what you're facing. Actually, it makes good sense to seriously consider it. One example, personally, I was the Gold Firearms commander for a 5-day manhunt that happened in the city of Londonderry. On day 2, I engaged a specialist firearms commander from Stephen's team at that time to review my strategy and review my plan, just to make sure. I knew the stakes were really high. There's a very high probability that somebody would end up being shot by police. But it was an invaluable experience that allowed me to change my plan, embrace emerging best practice, and I would encourage people to seriously consider using independent reviews. It's really healthy, and it allows you to really robustly have an independent eye over your plans and your strategies. And also the benefit as well, you can learn from what worked well and actually what didn't work so well. Business does this really, really well. What is working well is as important to them as what didn't work well, because actually that's important to us. So then in the future, to answer your question, Mark, we can improve how we plan the future, plan or improve our deliveries, and ultimately how we keep people safe as organizations. So that's kind of my kind of thoughts at this moment in time in terms of the learning process.
Thank you, Steve. And can I ask Alison, I mean, up on the screen there, we've got, the issue of stress and well-being of officers, which I think is something which is crucially important to any police commander, is understanding the stresses that their officers are subject to and how to manage the well-being. Do you have some thoughts on how that is an issue that can be dealt with? And also, how does one deal with the issue of gender balance and ethnic representation within the police themselves? It's important that a police force is reflective of the community that it serves. And how does one manage those issues?
Okay. Well, in relation to stress, I think, years ago, probably officers were less likely to ask for help or admit that they were feeling stressed. I think now it's much more openly discussed. There are welfare groups, occupational health and welfare, and there are procedures and policies in place just to support officers when they've been in difficult situations or they feel they need help. And I think it's about always reminding officers that that's available to them, and also recognizing within yourself, if you're in a leadership role or you've been in a stressful situation, that you are feeling stressed and developing sort of coping mechanisms or whatever you may need to do to help you deal with that, and to ask for help yourself if you need it. So I think it's just about making sure that that support's in place and that officers know how they can access that support, and that they don't feel they're going to be punished or disadvantaged in any way for seeking that type of support. And in relation to the gender balance aspect, what I would say in relation to that is the police service I joined in the late 1980s was a very different one to the one I retired from almost 30 years later. When I joined, the male officers were given guns and the female officers were given handbags. And whilst that's probably quite funny now looking back, the outcome of that was it prevented females from being appointed to roles where being armed was an essential requirement for that role. So a number of years after I joined, female officers did become armed, which then enabled them to then undertake the full range of policing roles. That led to a more balanced police service, which can help to build confidence in policing within communities, as the police is more representative and more relatable, I think. Better representation can also provide opportunities for mentoring. So we discussed females, so for example, females in specialist roles, which were previously very male dominated, can mentor and support other females who are interested in those roles. And that again will assist in improving the gender balance and representation. And I just finish off with a couple of statistics just in respect of PSNI representation, if I can, Mark. In 2001, there were approximately 13,000 police officers in Northern Ireland. Of that 13,000, 12.6% were female and 8.3% were Catholic. And current statistics would say that there are 6,700 police officers or members of the police service. Of that, 30% are female and 32% are Catholic. So we've gone some way in Northern Ireland to addressing the balance, and hopefully we'll continue to move in that upward trajectory to make sure that we do fully represent the communities that we serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you to the two Stephens as well. And I think that brings us very neatly to probably the most important part of this this webinar, and that's the opportunity for our participants now to ask some questions. I think we can see from the presentation that's been made that managing these protests is a very complex and a very difficult situation to manage. And I think we also see that each of the topics that has been addressed today, we've really only touched on the very basics of each one, and that there is an opportunity to delve into these in much more depth and detail in full training courses that can be offered. And we here at Themis Group would like to offer you those training courses if there is an interest in taking us up on that opportunity. But now I'd like to turn the floor over to all of you and ask if there are questions and a little bit of discussion around some of the points that our speakers have made. And what do we do to make policing for, as the picture says up on the screen, for a better tomorrow? So the floor is open if anyone wants to ask a question, and we'll happily pass you on to our colleagues. I'm going to stop sharing the presentation so that we get a more full screen view of everybody, and we can just see who would like to ask any questions if there are. If you'd like to ask a question, please just put your hand up. I see Jeremy Thompson. You'd like to ask a question, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, just thank you, Mark, and the rest of the panel for the contribution. I know the two Stevies, and hi, Alison. Good to meet you. A sort of broad question. We've talked a lot here about scenario and planning, and I'd like to hear maybe some views on those situations which are spontaneous and which are fast moving within communities that reach a public order situation very quickly. What would be the takeaways from the panel of how best to deal with those fast moving situations where you don't have the time to plan, sit down, work the scenarios out, etc.?
Stephen Corrigan, do you want to kick off on that one?
Yeah, the spontaneous ones tend to be obviously the ones that you control less, and this is where your professionalism comes into place as well. And it's also knowing your teams and knowing the people that you have responsible. I've dealt with many spontaneous events. For example, riots that kind of just materialize. And I would very quickly look at the resources that I have available. There are some teams, some units of people that I would not send to certain things. So the first point, Jeremy, I would say is very carefully consider who you're going to send, who you're going to actually deploy to deal with certain things, because actually there are some people who are much better dealing with certain things. So that's kind of my key point. The other point as well is grip. It's around leadership grip. I think that's so important, that as leaders, you must have grip of spontaneous events. I've had, some amazing experiences. For example, a spontaneous event, not a protest, but one night I got a phone call. I was a duty officer to say that there were 300 people on the Glen Shane Pass trapped in 4 feet of snow, from the duty officer. And he said, "Boss, I'm looking for some advice. The road's closed on both ends and in the middle. Have you any ideas what we do?" Those are the sort of spontaneous events that you really just apply your own professional experience, and you can get whatever who can actually help you. I rang the Coast Guard because I knew that that was my area. I knew we didn't have the resources to get up through the snow. I also contacted a friend who was in the Forestry Commission because I knew they had vehicles that would actually get us up through the snow. Now, a funny thing, I do remember ringing the duty officer that just on my way into work through the snow, and his advice was, "That's okay, ring me in the morning, let me know how it goes." So you'll not always get the support from people, but that's the reality. So I'm sure others have other things that they want to contribute to that question. It's a good question, Jeremy.
Yeah, maybe I come in, Stevie. Thanks, Jeremy. It is a really good question. And I suppose I would approach it from the really small and macro, and dealing with high threat stuff. I know my experience of in police career, Jeremy, was that the macro stuff never ever went to plan. It was very much spontaneous, that no matter how well you planned something, usually the wheel would come off at some point during its delivery. And agility in your people, for me, was the key thing in resolving a lot of that. And I think bringing that up into the community, you can probably extrapolate that out. And agility really is a key to help deal with a lot of that stuff. I know we talked here about a graduated response, and that's that has its place. But there's also a place for teaching and training your people to be able to reach into a toolbox and select the right tool to deal with whatever's in front of them. And if you make them agile enough and give them enough tools in that box, and that includes a lot of agility around their training programs, and a lot of crossover between the training programs, right from the very high threat stuff down to de-escalation tactics. Really running them through in scenario training, which Stevie talked about it. That's where the success has been for us over the years. It's just repeated scenario training, but never the same thing twice. And getting our people to make decisions, to select the tools out of the box that are appropriate for what they're dealing with, but that are going to protect both them, the community, and the organisation, because it's going to de-escalate it in the best way and the safest way possible. So that would be my contribution around agility and a broad church of training and equip your people to reach into that toolbox.
Thank you very much, guys. I think that's a good response. I have a question from Charles Heel. He says, does anyone think that some structures with historical, political, or religious value should be defended more vigorously than others? In particular, he's remembering the abandonment of the police station in Minneapolis during a riot situation. What are your thoughts on how do you deal with that kind of defending a particular area or a particular structure more vigorously than others?
If I can add something to that, that's a really good question, Charles. One of the things that we have found in Northern Ireland, is the past, the legacy stuff. My last department, we had 15 or over 1,000 unsolved murders. I mentioned about the many pieces of litigation. One of the things that's important is context. That situation you talk about years ago, it's very easy to look at that from the eyes of today, where you have all these resources, you have modern technologies, you've probably a lot more police officers. And we have found in Northern Ireland, in trying to defend what happened in the past, I'll give you the example. Kingsmills was a very public issue, one of the worst atrocities in Northern Ireland. 12 workmen who were shot, murdered in cold blood. That police officer, the detective sergeant, who was asked in his mid-70s to account for, well, the investigation you did was really poor. Can you account for that? And actually the context is very important. They were critical. It took you so many hours to respond to that incident. This was terrible. The investigation was really, really poor. Well, actually, when you hear in the context, well, actually the day before, police officers who responded to an event in that area, there was a landmine. The police officers were all blown up. The car was completely obliterated. We didn't respond because we were afraid that it was going to be another come on and there would be another event like that. Then he was asked, well, the very poor investigation you done, can you explain that? Well, he said, yes, I was assigned to me 2 detective constables. That was my team. On that one day, we were dealing with 3 separate murder investigations. I dealt with that incident in Kingsmills, and I went to another conference to deal with another murder. And I went to another murder that day. And he said, my poor investigation, yeah. And the next day, I went to other murders. But the reality is of the context, I think is really important. It's a really good question. And we have to choose. There are certain things that are not defensible, where there's been bad policing, bad practice, unethical practice. But the important thing is also the context of the day, I think, is really, really important. That people who don't have that memory understand this is the challenges that we faced in the past. Those officers that you're talking about, Charles, this is the context of what the situation was. They didn't have guns. They didn't have water cannons. They didn't have all the kit that we have today to protect themselves and so forth. And understanding the context, I think, is a really important point. I'll hand back to some of the colleagues might have other points.
Thank you, Stevie. Alison, Stephen, any thoughts on that one, or do we go on to the next question?
No, I think Stevie has covered it. No, I think context is vital, isn't it?
Another question then that's come up is one around leadership and the importance of leadership in managing conflict situations, and how has the police service of Northern Ireland try to develop leadership in terms of managing these situations? I mean, obviously, all of you have talked about the importance of having a plan, having a strategy, but there also has to be an element of understanding how leadership as a phenomenon plays a role in determining the outcome of these events. Alison?
Yeah, I think number one, I think you have to have leadership training. We have to train our leaders to train them to deal with those situations. Stephen talked about ethics, so we have to have ethical leaders who understand the purpose of the organization. And I also talked earlier about mentoring, and I think, you know, in any good leadership program, you want to have mentors, people that you can run decisions past. And I know within policing in Northern Ireland, we underwent a massive period of change. And I think the challenge for us as leaders at that time was to not only support our staff through that change, but also to make sure that the change was allowed to happen. So it's about employee engagement and explaining to staff and, you know, why the changes happen and what's expected of them in that change, to make sure that you bring your people along with you and that your leaders get the support from the senior team then to be able to make that happen.
And Stephen Cargan, I mean, can I ask you, you know, leadership being so crucially important, and I think it's important that good leadership provides confidence to those police officers who are out there on the ground. How do you see building good leadership as a key part of a policing organization?
Alison mentioned the point of trusting them, you know, training them, but empowering them is another point that I think is important. You know, we all hate micromanagers, but I think it's important as a leader to be empowered to actually be a leader. And sometimes the police is not that good at that at times, but empowering people to make decisions, to lead people and support them when they get it wrong, give them critique, but actually support them. Peer mentoring, coaching and so forth is an important part around that as well. Give them the opportunity to practice the skills. We've all done courses, and we know people who are course junkies and training junkies. They love to do courses. That's all very good, but actually having the competency is important as well. Practicing those skills. Another lesson that I think is important to share with the audience as well, because it's a really good question. In 2010, when austerity cuts hit the UK policing, but 20% of the budget was cut. What was one of the key things that most police services cut was leadership training. But the big problem was it was the leaders who were charged with the responsibilities of bringing in innovative practices, managing the huge challenges that policing faced. That's a challenge, but I share that learning with other people, that people learn from that, because leaders can't be taken for granted. They must be supported and helped, nurtured and developed in their skills.
Can I also, there's a great question from Colm. You know, can you comment on how you manage media relations during a riot situation? And what advice would you give to media in covering disorder in order to keep themselves safe? How do you manage that relationship with the media, that they don't actually get in the way, I suppose, of good policing, but nonetheless still are able to fulfill their function of being a public information function? Alison?
Oh, I'll need to think about that one. And because unfortunately we had a really terribly sad incident in Northern Ireland last year where a young journalist was observing a riot situation in Derry and was shot and died as a result. So I absolutely appreciate the question about journalists trying to reporting on the situation, on public interest situations, and keeping them safe. And I think there'd probably be a strategic element to that and the operational side on the ground. So I think it's around trying to identify where possible the commander on the ground and having a look at, you know, having a conversation about where is safe on the ground. Is there media messaging that we can do from the command room where it's safer that we get our, when I talked earlier on about our media messaging and our public messaging and how we control that? So it's around arranging, organising and having some protocols in place where we get that messaging out to the media without the media having to put themselves into difficult situations. And I would say that if we ask the media to move back, it's for their own safety and not because we're not wanting to impose or impact on the reporting of the situation in any way. Could I ask Colin if he has any experience in that, or no?
Colin, would you like to come back on that?
No. That's
You're still
okay.
on mute. You're on mute, Colin, if
Oh.
you wanted to make a point.
Yes, I mean, it's just a general point. I mean, I do have experience both here and in other countries, particularly in Gaza and places like that, covering, civil disorder, and the policing strategy can vary, and sometimes it's very hard to see what it is, and sometimes there is no strategy. It's just a militia or whatever. So it can be very variable. So no, it's just an interesting thing because obviously you could see it there in the more recent riots in Northern Ireland, particularly, where it's almost like a social media event, and it's almost done for social media, and done for social media effect.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of a bit of a change, kind of in this, so it was always done for effect and optics in a lot of ways, but because, if you take like a burning of a bus and things like that, it is going to get much more publicity around the world, even though it's a relatively small event. So it's interesting that there's a kind of a change in the dynamic, and obviously those protesters are using the power of social media for their own good, or whatever, their own particular propaganda purpose. And it's just interesting to see. But also, there's a difficulty there where now you probably have less experienced reporters, but also you have now the role of kind of a reporter is both a kind of multimedia journalist, where they're expected to take video footage and so forth, which means they have to get much closer to the action, and particularly say if they're using mobile phones to do it. Most of the mobile phones wouldn't have telephoto lenses, so they're putting themselves in a place that's of much more danger than perhaps before. And without going into details of the Lear McKee case, I mean, that was kind of something that similar to what had happened in that instance, so it's just kind of, it's getting that fine balance right, where sometimes if the media are asked to move back, or they're asking the question, well, are we being, our right under the Human Rights Act and so forth, are they being restricted by the police, and why so and whatnot? And then, do the police actually have the authority to do this? And again, there can be different regulations in different countries and different interpretations of them. So it's not a straightforward answer a question, but just generally from the point of view of operations, how it would work. And if we're trying to advise media how to engage with the police, but also to be that impartial observer, because they're there to observe the police reaction just as much as the protesters, so it's trying to get that balance right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Can I make a couple of points to Colin there as well?
Please do.
Really good observations, Colin. One of the things that I would encourage as journalists is to build relationships with the police media department. I think that's really important. From my experience, I've known loads of journalists over the years. It comes down to building relationships, and then for those journalists to be well informed by the police, before they go into areas, they know, if you build up trust with the police, they'll give you more information. That's a reality. But also just some simple tips. Know the area for journalists. Know the area that you're going into. Know the history. What's happened in the last 24 hours, the last few days even, is important. Learn to do your own risk assessments, your own dynamic risk assessment before you go in there. When you're in there, constantly looking at the risks, constantly observing, have your exit routes. Okay, things are starting to hotten up. How am I going to get out of here? Have I my car? Or am I just going to leave my car? Or am I going to get out of here? No police tactics is an important point as well. The police react to situations, and it's important to learn what police tactics are. Drawing battens, shield drills. When they see the riot guns coming out and so forth, they see dogs coming out. They see Land Rovers coming together and blocking roads, or they actually see the police driving out, that's a good sign that, well, everything's over, or things have got so bad, it's time to get out of there. I think that's really, it's the mood music, learning to read the mood music in each areas, and seek advice from the police. You know, as you build those relationships with them, seek advice. You know, even during the event, you know, you'll have your points of contacts with the police, not just the media department, but neighbourhood police officers, TSG officers, commanders, and so forth, and actually be able to have that, be able to make the phone call to them and say, listen, what's happening here? Do you think I should move? I should stay, or whatever? That's kind of some of the practical things that I would suggest, Colin. But really, you make very good points.
Mhm.
Thank you so much, and thanks, Colin, for the question. I think it was a great one. Another question from Nigel. With so many protests in Northern Ireland each year, over 3,000, how do you prevent gold strategy from becoming just a cut and paste exercise? How can the character and the ethics of the commander show through and be an integral part of the response that police provide? Stephen Corgan, I suspect that one's directed at you.
Good. That's a very good question, Nigel. And that is the reality. You know, I'll put my hands up. You know, quite often you do cut and paste gold strategies because they're very repetitive. But every commander has their own style. And my style was very much hands-on, personal grip, personally accountable, and actually chairing gold meetings with my team. Yes, the strategy's there, but actually putting my own stamp on it. You know, making sure that people know, here's what I expect from you. Here's the style. Yeah, it's a cut and paste. That's my kind of plan. But actually, here's what I expect from you. And also holding people accountable for delivery of those things. I think that's really, really important. Listening to people, challenging people. It's, you know, it's really easy to kind of almost, yeah, that's the strategy, that's the way we do it. But the bottom line is, it's realizing as a gold commander or as a leader, you're ultimately responsible. You know, people will know if you do cut and paste strategies, because actually they'll get access to your strategies. But you know, minutes of meetings and so forth will actually be the demonstration of how serious and how good a leader you are and how accountable you are. So that's where it really means more than just a cut and paste, Nigel. It's where you actually put your own stamp on it in terms of being a leader, being accessible to your people, you know, having regular meetings with them, listening, communicating, and so forth. It's more than just a written strategy. It's a live piece of paper, but it's a live piece of leadership. You know, an event, a plan, and so forth. It's just more than a cut and paste. That's my personal experience with it.
Stephen Atkinson, any thoughts on that from you?
Sorry, I lost you there, Mark, for a while with some internet connection problems there. Yeah, no, just to fully reiterate everything that Steve had said there, it is possible that, you know, to stamp your own signature on your plan. And absolutely, we've all been to demonstrations and policing operations that have just been cut and paste, but those ones that have gone well and have gone really well and gone beyond actually dealing with what's happened on the night and reached out into the community and helped solve things going forward long term, you can see those, and it's clearly evident from those that the commander was really engaged with his plan, and it reached far beyond the day or the night in question.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Steve. I don't have any other further questions coming out. Jeremy, you had a question. Please go ahead.
Sorry, just my last question. I'm just curious from an objective point of view, if the panel has any views on recent events in Northern Ireland where police liaising with event organisers has been identified as possibly too cozy a relationship. And what do you think are the learning points as we know them so far from the recent report from the HMIC?
I think that's what's known as a hot potato, and we'll throw it in the direction. We'll throw it in the direction of Stephen Cargan and see what he has to say. Stephen.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, Jeremy. You're referring to the Bobby Story investigation, I'm presuming. This is the reality of policing in Northern Ireland, where there are established relationships with people, and that's very important. You know, where you have established relationships, build up trust with people, but there are certain parameters that I've always enforced, and I think the problem, having read that report and reviewed that report, is you know, that investigation will continue on. It's where it went from the relationships to people saying, well, I didn't know. And this is where it's important that when, you know, if you have a relationship with somebody, this was all to do with COVID regulations and enforcement of the regulations, where it was down to one person's word against the other. My experience has always been, well, actually, yeah, here's the requirements, but here I'm serving you notice. And I think that this was where a lot of this fell down. They talk about UK policing, the 4 E's, but the engagement seemed to fall around there and the explanation. And I think it's important for, and I share this as a learning point with others, don't expect people to go away and say, yeah, verbally, I understand what you're saying, when you know the consequences could potentially be really, really serious. Serve them with a notice. Have a witness to you serving that notice. Even take photographs of it, record it. And I think that this is where that particular plan fell down, Jeremy, from my reading of it. And I'm not fully au fait of all the facts, so I don't want to be overcritical. I'm only commenting from what I've read, that there seemed to be a breakdown of people saying, well, actually, we didn't understand. The other thing as well, it comes down to your planning as well. I think in that event, there was 11th hour, there was a change of legislation the night before the event. And this is another piece of learning for the audience. You know, you don't learn to dance before the ball. Having realized that people knew that legislation was going to change the night before, those discussions should have been had with the legislators, the Northern Ireland Assembly, Department of Justice, the PPS and so forth, Police Legal Services. What is this legislation change going to be, and how will it impact on our plan? I think that those are all things where it comes down to really good planning, but actually really good partnership working. And it's I got a bit of advice when I was a sergeant, just a young sergeant from a very old, experienced superintendent. He said to me, young fella, you're going to have to learn to look round corners and look through a wide angle lens when you're making decisions. That's really good. You do in policing. You need to look a long view with a wide angle lens and actually learn to look round corners, because that's the reality. And I can see the audience and my colleagues understand what I'm saying there. That's a really interesting report. We could certainly do a lesson on that alone. But to answer your question there, Jeremy, I think relationships are really important, but going beyond the relationships, knowing that actually at the end of the day, as a police service, we have a role and responsibility to legally enforce things. And actually it goes beyond that, you know, yeah, we have a relationship, but no, when it comes to the bit, if I have to enforce the law, we'll enforce the law. Do you think that's answered your question? Anything you want to come back at me there?
That's fine, Stevie. I knew that it was sort of contemporary, and the views that we get would be objectives. No, thank you.
Thank you.
And I think it's a good.
Just add to that, Steve, Mark. Yeah. I think Northern Ireland's the gift that keeps giving, and whether we agree or whether you disagree with what took place, it just reinforces what we've been learning in this wee province for decades now, and that's that strategic issues in law enforcement have long-term repercussions in the community on one side or the other. And for me, that's the big lesson out of these things, whether, as I say, whether you agree with them, whether you don't, the impact that they have going forward is massive. It's huge, because it loses one side or another, loses confidence in the community, which ultimately breaks down that confidence in policing again. So I suppose it just reiterates the need for considered strategic Really focused strategic leadership around these decisions. Not just to look at the there and then. It's not just about the funeral or the protest. It's about 10 years time. It's about 15 years time where you are with the community and the impact it's had. Has it contributed to making it better, or has it contributed to making it worse? That's a lesson for me out of it.
And I think it's a great lesson that to bring us to almost a close, because I think we've been at this now for quite a long time, and we've imposed on our guests for a long period this afternoon. And if there are no more questions, perhaps we'll try and bring it to a close. But I think the points that the two Stephens have made are excellent ones, in that it's about decision making that will withstand the kind of scrutiny that is inevitable in the modern day policing environment. There is media everywhere. Literally everybody is a journalist these days. Everyone has a camera in hand, and the decisions that police leadership make and the decisions that police officers on the front line make on a day-to-day basis will be subject to scrutiny and raked over many, many times in the future. And those decisions will have to be justified. So having the skills, having the capacity to manage these events in the most effective way possible is absolutely crucial for police services to be able to be effective and to be able to work with the kinds of communities that they find themselves in a way that results in an outcome that is acceptable to everyone. I want to thank our speakers, Stephen Cargan, Alison Ferguson, Stephen Atkinson, and I'd like to thank all of you who have participated this afternoon and this evening in this event. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I think there's been a great deal to learn, and I hope that you will, as participants, feel free to get in touch with us again if there's a question that comes up later. That 3 in the morning when you suddenly think, damn, I should have asked that question. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with us by email. Keep an eye on the website, and of course, if there is an opportunity for us as an organization to work with you in your organization and to help and to guide and work with you in developing a better relationship with the communities that you are involved with and in policing those communities, that's something that we're very interested in working with you on in the future. So thank you all again for your presence this afternoon, and I'd like to wish you all a really fantastic day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.